I really want people, young and some not so young, to know that what you read in history is not just about names and dates to remember for a test. These are things that happened to real people, had impact on real families. And if nothing else, they need to know this so that it won't happen again. Because we're in a situation now where I think we need to be very cognizant of things that happen, why they happen, and what can be done to prevent them from happening again.
I'm not sure I'd ever even heard the Ernest Green story, despite the Disney film. I think I knew that President Eisenhower had sent troops at some point to escort black students into a school in Little Rock during desegregation, but what I knew was a story that was blacks and whites. It wasn't really a story about people, these people, the children who faced that, their families and their community. How that pivotal incident not only impacted all of them, but also how the before, during, and after effects shaped and were shaped by the people they are. No, how would I know that? I was a white kid who grew up in rural Nebraska in the 70s. I knew something about Arkansas because that's where my parents had grown up, where we went for Christmases or summer vacations to see grandparents. I knew how, apparently, the N-word had softened in much of the white dialect to Nigra, and I knew that there weren't any more whites-only fountains or bathrooms by that time that I was around, so I guess like a lot of white folks, I assumed we'd worked out all the race stuff by the time the civil rights era was over. It is over, right?
Speaking of race stuff, I grew up in the middle of South Dakota, with 3 Native American reservations within a short distance of my hometown. Yet I knew nothing about my indigenous neighbors. Growing up, I had friends who were Lakota, but I knew nothing about what that actually meant for them or for me. In school, I remember making a construction paper headdress that had vowels on each feather in first grade, and I remember coloring pictures of cartoon pilgrims and Indians at Thanksgiving time. But that's about it. Looking back, knowing what I know now, I'm guessing that teachers and communities just wanted to keep things peaceful, following a long stretch of unrest where race is concerned. With the history and continuation of boarding schools, the generational trauma of assimilation tactics, the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890 and occupancy of 1973, things were pretty raw between whites and natives. In many ways, it's been within the last decade that real work has been done to address the race relations in our state.
So how did a couple of white folks from the Midwest get involved with this? Well, that's where Triopia comes in.
Triopia Green Washington is Ernest Green's older sister. She had been coming to South Dakota for years in connection with her work at the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards, helping teachers, like me in South Dakota, become nationally board certified. At some point, she became interested and involved in an ongoing South Dakota civil rights issue, addressing inequities in the education of Indigenous students. Indigenous elders in the region had developed a set of essential understandings which had been adopted by the state to be implemented in all schools. We had been invited by a group of those elders to figure out a way to help teachers, most of whom were white, use those understandings in their classrooms. We determined that the most powerful way to do that was to make sure that every teacher got to see and hear the faces and voices of those elders, and that those faces and voices found a clear pathway into every classroom. In that way, the Wolakota Project was born, a key element of which is video interviews of elders from every tribal nation in our state, sharing their wisdom in ways that are aligned to the adopted essential understandings. Triopia eventually moved on to work for Bowie State, a historically black university, but continued the South Dakota connection and became so intrigued with the model and process, she agreed to serve on the Wolacota Project Advisory Board and began presenting along with us at various state conferences, always suggesting, "I think this approach could work in our black communities too."
But what's the story? What's the perspective that needs to be uncovered? The answer was right there in the Green family itself. The Green Siblings Project was conceived while Triopia was visiting South Dakota in 2017 to speak to educators about the 60th anniversary of the 1957 desegregation of Little Rock Central High School. Triopia explained the unique perspectives of the three siblings, Triopia, Ernest, and Scott Green, who experienced together three different elements of the school segregation-desegregation era.
Triopia had experienced a fully segregated schooling with black classmates and black teachers, who, in spite of segregated conditions, always projected and expected excellence. Her brother Ernest, one of the Little Rock Nine, and the only senior, experienced the forceful shift into the 1957 desegregation of Little Rock Central High School, when protests were so violent that President Eisenhower had to assign 1,000 soldiers from the 101st Paratrooper Division to escort the 9 students. Scott, the youngest sibling, became a member of the Lost Class when all Little Rock high schools were closed by Governor Faubus, following Ernest's graduation at the end of that tumultuous year. Scott Green had to leave Little Rock for California just to complete his 10th grade year.
I often talk with my brothers about how fortunate we were to grow up in the kind of family that we did. My mother was a teacher. My mother received her bachelor's degree in 1924 from Wilberforce College in Ohio. My father was a World War I veteran. And in fact, some of the first words that I remember being taught were "Parlez-vous français?" He spent quite a bit of time in Marseille, and I recall his talking about that. My father probably finished maybe elementary school, but was a huge proponent of education and supported everything that the family felt that the three of us should do educationally. But it was a family that not just supported, but reinforced our doing our best at everything. I can remember coming home and telling my mother when I was in elementary school or junior high that I'd gotten first prize or had gotten and earned an A or something, and she would say, "That's nice, but remember, you can always do better."
I grew up in a two-family household. A sister who won't admit it, but she's a few years older than I am. And a brother who's a few years younger than I'm the middle child. The neighborhood that I grew up in was probably, I thought, ideal. I mean,
Mother and auntie, they made sure that we knew how to function in the world. My mother, since I'm the last one, my mother taught me how to take care of myself. And when I say myself, I used to help Mother with her dresses when she was in college. help her do the dresses. I'd have to put the damn thing on, and Mother would do the hem. But I learned how to sew from my mother, and especially how to take care of yourself. And when I say take care of yourself, you know, it's basic to be clean. You don't have to have a whole lot of money if you have certain things ingrained in you. But this was growing up in the Green household.
Well, I guess growing up in a fairly monocultural community in the Midwest had made me think that any black children growing up in the Jim Crow South would have had a drastically different experience than my own. And sure, in some ways, the Greens were having to deal with things I'd never dealt with, but in many very fundamental ways that included family and community dynamics. I was finding out that their monocultural experience in pre-1957 Jim Crow Little Rock, Arkansas, was very similar to my own post-1964 all-white growing up days in York, Nebraska.
While in Little Rock, we visited Central High School, which is still an operating high school but is also a National Historic Site, maintained by the Park Service. We spent some time with Park Superintendent Robin White, who has for several years brought focus on young people and how they were a part of this movement.
Learning about people, learning about the Little Rock Nine, learning about the McDonald Tree, learning about Ruby Bridges, and knowing that these were young people that fought back. These were young people that stood up to the system. These were young people that stood up to oppression. You know, where did that come from? Where did that courage come from? And why can't we all have that strength, you know? And so we're constantly taking, I say that, in doing that, we have to learn to give back. We have to recognize that we don't own this. We are the facilitators in life and sharing life with each other.
The Greens were young people thrust into the civil rights movement just as they were working to finish high school, start jobs, and all the regular stuff. Suddenly, Ernest had to be escorted by soldiers to get to school, and Scott had to go to California to finish 10th grade. Triopia was trying to support from a distance while they experienced something very different from her pre-desegregation experience of Little Rock. Part of giving back, as Robin shared, is sitting down now and sharing the story, making sure that people know what really happened so that history doesn't repeat itself.
As we listen to the Green siblings and Robin share their stories and wisdom around events connected with the Little Rock Central High School desegregation chapter of the Civil Rights Movement, we began to identify themes and patterns of learning that might help others to connect and more deeply understand not only the events around Central High School desegregation, but also patterns of loss and growth in their own lives. We were seeing how their experiences held big lessons for ourselves and for people anywhere who are trying to navigate issues of segregation, misunderstanding, injustice, and inequity. We formulated this loss and growth continuum to express what we were learning.
At the time of the Little Rock 9 desegregation incidents, many groups and individuals in the city of Little Rock found themselves right in the middle of the continuum pictured here. Segregation was the norm, and inequality was the reality. The Green siblings and others interviewed for this project tell often of the positive movements toward the right of this graphic through desegregation and a move toward more equality, toward, hopefully, a stronger, healthier place of equity and integration. But we also realized that this story, and indeed the story of all human beings, doesn't begin in inequality and segregation. Though there are many factors that impact individuals before birth and involving the families and communities that they are born into, we know that every human being is, at his or her inception and core, filled with integrity and equity. Many educators and child development researchers have documented the various ways children experience both loss and a sense of division as they move through stages of maturation. Not every child moves as fully into the experience of inequality and segregation as some do, but we all experience some inevitable struggles with separation from others, or with a growing sense of the unfair or uneven elements of society. Our hope, as shown in this continuum, is that wherever we may find ourselves, the end goal of our journey is one of equity and integration with others.
If Brown versus Board of Education was the ruling that set the desegregation of American schools into motion, the Green siblings show us the faces and the voices of that ruling's impact. Though we have learned so much from our hundreds of hours of interview conversations with Indigenous elders, and from years of conversations with Triopia, we knew we had more to learn, and we knew where the learning power was situated, in the voices and faces of those who have first-hand experience. So with cameras in hand, and during pandemic times, with the safety of the Zoom connection, we set out to see what more we could learn from the three Green siblings, from their stories, but also from the dynamic of a single family journeying through tumultuous times in unified but distinct ways. We can't capture everything in a single documentary, but we can set out a map for further learning, for further growth. We hope this will be a path you will take up in your own community, whether, like us, you have been sheltered and blinded by privilege, or you have been through your own journey of navigating and overcoming the inequities woven into the fabric of our society.
Think about desegregation versus integration. They are not the same. To desegregate doesn't mean to integrate. And unfortunately, desegregation is what has happened in most cases, and not integration. No.
I always wondered when the Supreme Court decision was first handed out, who was going to implement it? Because the proof in the pudding was it's one thing to get the agreement, but the other one is who's going to carry it out, and that seemed to me a lot more difficult than simply handing down the decision.
And even though we grew up during the days of Jim Crow and segregation, we never felt denied, and we never felt less than, because excellence was always reinforced. And I remember my mother, once there was something, some discussion regarding race and race relations, and my mother said, "You're going to find people of every race that you like better than others, and some that you like less than." So we never label people by race.
Going back to the country club, I had sort of a friendly relationship with one of the members' sons. So one day he came flying into the locker room and said, you know, he was admonishing me, how could I do this? I was such a nice guy. So And I was bewildered at first what the hell he was talking about. Well, it turned out that the local newspaper had published the names of the students who had been approved to transfer, partly to get them all, everybody to quit, I'm sure.
There was a time when all the kids used to leave to go to Central High from our house. They'd put all the kids in a station wagon, long green station wagon. They'd have a Jeep with a machine gun mount in the front and Jeep with a machine gun mount in the back. And they go to school like this. From our house, my house, the house I lived in. I'm looking at, you know what I mean? I'm living this.
And the first time that I really thought about being black was when I went to a store in Little Rock with my mother. And it was Blast, which was a pretty big department store. And I wanted to, it was, you know, a hot day in Little Rock, and I needed a drink of water. And I saw this water fountain, and I stopped to drink out of it. Well, it turns out it was the whites only water fountain. I thought my imagery as a 6-year-old was that this hand came out of the sky. It seemed admonished me for drinking out of that water fountain, and couldn't do that and couldn't do this, and I didn't understand. But I knew enough to know that this was something I wasn't supposed to do. At 6 years old was my first encounter with segregated life. Now, because my mother didn't drive, occasionally we took the bus. Blacks boarded the bus in the back, whites in the front. If it was a day in which you had some white person who would get on the bus, and if there were no seats for them, the rule was that if you were black, you had to get up and give your seat.
But you don't miss what you don't know. And growing up during that time, we knew what the rules were. And I guess that's why when Ernest started Central, everybody was shocked at the reaction, because Little Rock had never been a violent place. There were the black neighborhoods, and there were the other neighborhoods. And as I mentioned, when we were coming here, there were the hotels, and we couldn't go to the hotels because the laws prohibited that, nor could we go to the restaurants. But that in no way diminished anything that we felt about ourselves, about our families, or about our neighborhoods.
Changing laws doesn't automatically change hearts and minds of people. It doesn't create openness or welcoming ways. Desegregation can actually make things worse for a time as we all move toward actual integration. In spite of the challenges, though, Triopia reaffirmed the resilience fostered by her family and her community. She said, "This experience didn't change how we felt about ourselves." Not every family, not every community is as equipped to support that kind of resilience. We have to learn that.
Things were desegregated because of legal challenges and economic realities. This moved Little Rock in the direction of equality, but integrating requires not only equality, but equity, a step beyond. Equality isn't equity. It's important to clarify the difference between the two. Equality fits into legal, economic ways of looking at issues. Equity looks beyond the numbers to what is just and best for all. Equity isn't just fairness. It's acting strategically for what's best for everyone and for us as a whole. It's seeing us as a whole, but not seeing us as all the same. Equality still leaves deficits, but some of us have a hard time even seeing inequity. Our blindness is our privilege.
We're constantly talking about equality, but is there such a thing? What about equity? And maybe that's what we should start looking at, because there's always going to be one with their foot on the other. There's always going to be someone at the top that wants to be at the top. But if we have those same advantages or those same resources at this point, what we do with them is upon us. If we all start there with the equity.
A guy came up to me and said, your grandfather was a real activist. He didn't use he used a few other words to describe him, and said that he had tried a number of times to vote in the Democratic primary. That made him a real activist, actually a rebel.
The nursing and teaching were the occupations and professions that African American women could aspire to. So we had the best of teachers, but again, the physical resources, I can remember hand-me-down books that we had received from Central High School. You could tell there was writing all in them. And one of the things that I guess if I regret anything, was the fact that there were no art courses offered at my high school. And I always liked to draw and sketch and wished that I could have taken formal art.
And it would be a moot point if nobody black decided to transfer. We went down, had this meeting. He described all the things that you couldn't do as a transfer student. You couldn't participate in extracurricular activity. I was in the band and a series of other things, and none of that would be possible. But I figured if they were putting all these restrictions on, that this had to be a bigger deal than they were letting on. And it made me think that this was the right thing to try and do.
Of the lost class, this is a class the year after Ernest graduated that were victims of the closed schools. The governor closed every high school in Little Rock because he was determined that no other black person would graduate from Central. And my brother Scott was in the 10th grade. My mother, he told me last year, I didn't know this, that my mother tried him in 8 different school districts around Little Rock, but because she was teaching and my father had passed, logistically, it was just impossible to operate under the circumstances. So in October of that year, she sent him to Oakland, California, to live with 2 aunts whom he had never met. But I really think his experiences just really soured his relationship with formal ed, although we always said he was the smartest one of all of us, and is probably now the best well-read of the three of us.
I was in the Air Force, stationed in Montana, when I took my GED. I hear about these people studying. I mean, long study just to pass a GED. It came to me one morning, okay, you're gonna take your test. And I took it and passed. And that was my high school.
Dr. King and nonviolence was not the mode that he particularly wanted to go down. He, in fact, used to tell me that we have to fight back, be willing to. I said, I don't think so, because there are 2,000 students in that school and the 9 of us, we can't fight our way through it. My brother and I have grown close over the years, but I always wanted to, since he was at home with me, to make sure that I was maintaining his support and that he was willing to be there for me, and he was. He was always very helpful.
I think I may have mentioned too that Scott was one of the first people in the program that Ernest was director of in New York that placed minority men and women trained them rather to join labor unions and to do construction work. And Scott became the first black member of the Sheet Metal Workers Union 28 in New York. And to this day, he is still involved in litigation for equity and equality. I just feel that that experience in 57 and 58 was something that had long-term effects and not really positive effects.
It's like the world was kind of exploding a little bit. Brother started the recruitment and training program, which is how I got into 28 in the first place. But there were a lot of things happening, and a lot of things were happening at the same time. And I had seen all of this that was happening. I guess I said to myself, I'm not going to go this academic route. I want to see what else is going on in this world, because there's too much going on out here. I've been involved in a fight for reparations for people of color, especially black people in Local 28, for years. Because when I came into Local 28, we had a president, Mel Farrell, and he said it publicly, let it be known, ain't no niggas coming in Local 28.
Somebody's got to step forward on it. And I figured, I saw what Jackie Robinson did in baseball and a few other things beginning to break through. I said, why not me? Conveniences of Jim Crow's life were such that one night the black school played, the next night the white school played. Because again, getting back to what they could afford, they couldn't afford 2 football stadiums. So we all had to use the one at Central. And I always remember marching up and down the field during halftime or whatever we were doing, and thinking the Central High School is 3 times the size of the school that I go to. I mean, what the hell could they be doing in there? So both my curiosity and the fact it came out of this family of teachers that they knew that Central had, more books, more science labs, more this, more that.
You really didn't have to be a rocket scientist to figure that a building 3 times the size of yours had more going on in it. And it was, our experience, school experiences were rich. But again, physical resources were limited. So it was, you didn't dwell on what you didn't have. That was, I think, the key. We knew that we had excellent support. So you could just go around the neighborhood and count the successes of people who had received, I think, the kind of psychological support without some of the physical amenities.
Privilege comes in many flavors, connected with race, gender, economic status, class, education, sexual orientation. Privilege enables us to fly high above the negative consequences that might otherwise alert us to inequities. We don't feel the inequity, so it doesn't exist for us. Connecting with others and hearing their stories, like those of the Green siblings or those of the indigenous elders we've interviewed, can alert those with privilege to the structural problems in society. But if we aren't around those others to hear their stories, or if we choose not to listen, then we stall out in our own growth toward equity and integration. We become part of the problem, not the solution. Privilege allows us to say, well, we have a law now. Everyone gets the same thing, problem solved.
Generations of families have suffered inequality and inequity. It's a generational deficit. Just because a law changes doesn't mean that it will change my family's deficit. I'm starting in a different place, a deeper hole farther from the starting line. The problem with privilege is that just because we changed the laws, that's only the beginning of the work, not the end. As Ernest shared, the changing of the law didn't guarantee Black students would want to be a part of it.
Scott's experience led him to question nonviolence and Dr. King's way. He felt it was important to fight. Ernest didn't see fighting as an option, but he did see it as important to stand up for things that were important to him. Ernest's question, "Why not me?" is a theme that all 3 siblings embraced in different ways. They took the role of change agents seriously, though each took it on in a different way that fit their own personal experience.
We learned from listening to the Greens that in any relationship, individual, family, community, humanity, dominant and non-dominant positions play a big role. As we take action, our actions impact others around us as well as ourselves. Often, the privilege of a dominant position allows us to remain unaware of the outcomes others may suffer. To communicate some of what we've learned, we developed this action to outcome continuum.
At the time of the Little Rock 9 desegregation incidents, at least one very clear dominant-non-dominant action and outcome relationship was foremost. A majority of the white community was in denial that there was any problem with segregation, while most or all of the black community felt utterly disempowered. The process of desegregation, through much pain and struggle, resulted in a growing awareness of inequity among the white community and expanded opportunity for learning and education among those in the black community. In the best of situations, of course, this cycle leads to actions of restorative justice within the white community, exemplified, for instance, by Triopia, Washington, receiving the degree, honor, and apology her mother should have received years earlier from the University of Arkansas, and toward true empowerment within the black community. It is also important to note that just and powerful is the inherent state of all human beings who enter the world, but that societal norms teach most of us early on that we are privileged in particular ways at cost to others, or that we are denied in particular ways due to some societal status that falls beneath others. What is important to understand within this cycle is that the dominant, non-dominant designation is fluid for each individual, depending upon the situation and the circles of identity involved. I may find myself on the disempowered end of one situation because of my gender, and yet in a privileged position given my social or economic status.
Knowing that I don't need you to validate me. When we say we're standing on the shoulders of our ancestors, well, we need to get off their shoulders and get to work, right? And so the Little Rock Nine are still here, and there's so much, or the eight of them, there's so much we can learn from them. We miss so many opportunities to celebrate our similarities and our differences because we let society prescribe to us what we should be thinking. We let society dictate to us who we are, what we should believe in, instead of knowing who we are and moving away from the traps that are set. Those, those minefields are there, and we're constantly blowing ourselves up.
I guess I've been convinced that, and more than one person has said this, that you're not talking about yourself. You are sharing things that people need to know about. These are things that happen to real people, had impact on real families. And if nothing else, they need to know this so that it won't happen again. Because we're in a situation now where I think we need to be very cognizant of things that happen, why they happen, and what can be done to prevent them from happening again.
My mother had them to put on her credit card, Mrs. Lothair Green. And she said the reason she did that, she didn't want some clerk calling her girlie or auntie, some derogatory title. She'd have to call her by her name on the card, which was Mrs. And calling somebody black Mrs. was probably a faux pas. They didn't think they had to do that. When they looked at her credit card, they didn't know whether Mrs. was her surname or what it was, but it was on the card. Somehow we had visionaries in our families who really thought that this was the right thing to do.
I'm beginning high school, and he closes all the high schools in the city. But it just messed up everything. When I say messed up, and I guess I had kind of made my mind up that I wasn't going to go the academic route through my life, because I wanted to see what else was out there. I wanted to see how that other side of that coin gets greased to make the other side act the way that it acts. You know what I'm saying? When I was in Glasgow, Montana, I think the tribe were Blackfoot. One time I went to where the government, what is it? The reservation. A cinder block place with the cutouts for the windows and just a rag hanging in the window. And I was up there, this was when it was cold. This government treated the native people on those reservations like a piece of garbage. I mean, just the fact now, today, there are organizations that have built up. There are people, there are folk out here now that are still pissed that Custer got wiped. When I say because they think that the white man, not for nothing, but when he came over here, they should have just wiped them all out.
Getting to know where the obstacles are, how you prepare for them. To me, that's one of the great things that we got out of Central.
I still think all people know too little about other people. You can't help, when you get to know people and know them as people without stereotyping, good things happen. I think about when Todd was in elementary school, and one of the things, again, this is from home, you never label people by color. That just was not. So I was trying to find out who his teacher was. So I said, well, what does she look like? She's okay. Okay. What color is her hair? I don't know, but what color are her eyes? I don't know. And I was not gonna, so I found it was not until PTA that I went up there and I found out who she was. There is this, in some cases, this built-in stereotype that just some people can't get rid of. I often talk about my experience when I went to Australia. It was really good for me. I was walking down the street and I kept bumping into people. I said, okay, Triopia, you're doing something wrong. So I stood back against the building and I watched. And I realized that there everything went from the left and we're accustomed to doing things from the right, which taught me, said, just because you do something one way doesn't mean that it's wrong. Other people do things another way, and it's right. But I think so many times people don't, if anything is different, it's bad, it's negative. But it's such a rich experience to be around and to have experiences with people whose backgrounds and experiences are different from yours.
As we tried to put the stories shared by the Green siblings into context, we began to realize the importance of recognizing how our identities shift as we engage with others. We move back and forth among intersecting circles of identity that impact how we relate to others. Most of the time, we aren't even aware of the ways we navigate these identities. We developed this intersectional circles of identity graphic to explore how that happens.
No matter what family or community you're a part of, you have numerous skills, talents, perspectives, and abilities that make you unique. Stereotyping tends to flatten all individuality into one broad and exaggerating caricature based upon the larger group one is a part of. In this way, stereotyping is dehumanizing. When we stereotype an individual, we also attempt to steal the individual's right to engage with society in a way that's consistent with their own inherent right to define or name themselves.
Family is defined in different ways by different people, but every individual defines his or her own family at some point as they move into adulthood. Family members can become family because of births, marriages, ceremonies, adoptions, deep relationships, special circumstances, or simply by personal choice. However family is defined, it generally includes the first and most powerful set of relational influences individuals have, more influential than most other communities we may be a part of.
Most individuals are members of many communities. Some of these communities may be ones we choose, some may be categories others place us into based upon ethnicity, gender identity, national origin, color, body type, religious or political affiliation, hobby interest, sports team or music preference, or any number of other characteristics that may tend to create a common or shared identity within a community. Since we are members of many communities, occasionally we find ourselves members of communities that are in some way at odds with or in tension with each other. In this same way, we may find ourselves, by choice or by default, to be seen as envoys or ambassadors of one community within another.
In our conversations, Robin White asks some important questions about our humanity. Encompassing all of our individuality, our family and community identities, we are human beings. We are a humanity that makes us all family, whether we realize it or not. As Robin points out, there are consequences that come with extending our respect beyond our comfortable circles. Consequences that come with celebrating differences rather than fearing them. Robin reminds us in another statement that is now one of the guiding phrases for this project. You must take care of the root, for to heal the tree. Our common root draws upon our common humanity.
What the Little Rock Nine endured, we're still dealing with it 61 years later. That society is continually prescribing how we perceive each other. I am still questioning what's going on. Where's our humanity? Why is our humanity missing? We forget about that there were children that were making decisions that would impact the world and enduring and taking on a responsibility that most adults could not handle. We forget that the movement were built on the backbones of our youth, and it's happening again today, 61 years later. But what is our responsibility as council of elders?
Mother always said that each of us was equally important to she and my father. And that's the way we were trained, and that's the way we grew up.
The main thing is believing in yourself. This is a lot of tired cliches built around the story, but we all have something to contribute. We just have to get young people to believe that story is worth telling and that they've got something to talk about.
In every tree, there's a forest. Well, in every boy, there's a man. Every girl, there's a woman. If we snuff out that seed, what do we have? We've lost. And that's what's happening today. Where is our humanity? And I'm coming right back full circle. The consequences of humanity in respecting each other, in loving each other, in uplifting your neighbor, in supporting your neighbor. What is wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with being human, but it's exhausting, very exhausting, trying to teach others and trying to validate myself as a human being, trying to get someone to see me as a human being. That is exhausting for me, for Native Americans, to be seen in the eyes of humanity, trying to convince people that I am a good person, that a Native American is a good person. But if we're saying we don't want to hear it, if we're saying, sit down, shut up, you're too young to have your own thoughts. If we had did that, and if the Little Rock Nine had believed in it, what would have happened? We wouldn't be here today. So we have to support our youth in their effort in making this world a better place. We have to do that. And we have to let them know how significant they are and that they are important.
I realize how little people know. And I think it's really, really important for people to know from whence they cometh. Number one, history repeats itself. And I think we're seeing vestiges of that now. And there's another saying, you won't know where you're going unless you know where you have been. So the fact that you are doing this and have felt that the experiences that we've had are worth sharing is something that I personally really appreciate.
Like the Green siblings, we all live in challenging times that present us with opportunities to grow and challenges to increase the types of people and communities we interact with. In the public square, we're discussing and debating many issues that are new to many of us. Systemic racism, police violence, white privilege, microaggressions, social justice. These things may sound new to many of us who have had the privilege of not experiencing them personally in our family or in our close communities. But it's important to realize, as the stories of the Green siblings bear out, these are not new things. These issues are as old as humanity, but we have a new opportunity now to become aware and active in solving them together.
The impact of the Green siblings' story will continue to live on long into the future. Their story invites each of us to think about our own stories. How are we being called upon to live out the work of equity in our lives? Maybe we aren't experiencing anything like the ways that Triopia, Ernest, and Scott were propelled from living their lives as young people into the spotlight of the civil rights movement. But we each have a story. Each of us experiences loss, segregation, inequity in some way. And each of us has an opportunity to respond to those experiences in ways that not only help ourselves, but maybe help others in the process. The Green Siblings Project, through the telling of their experiences, offers people today and well into the future opportunities to know about the history of their family throughout the civil rights movement, its impact, and how to learn from it to continue to work toward a more equitable future for us all.